This isn't a tale born from imagination. It's a heartfelt true story about Elaine Mercer, a woman as ordinary as any of us who encountered the unimaginable. Life threw her into moments so intense they would shake even the firmest faith. Picture a life marked by trials that seem impossible to overcome. That's what this story reveals. It's a journey that might challenge what you believe, expand the way you see your own limits, and maybe even help you rediscover a sense of hope. Through Elaine's words, you'll come to see that miracles aren't confined to ancient texts. They can unfold in the quiet corners of everyday life, just waiting to be noticed. Ah, there you are. I've been hoping you'd stop by. Come sit with me for a while. I want to share something that still stirs my soul, no matter how much time has passed. It was one of those April afternoons you don't easily forget. I found myself sitting alone on a bench in the hospital garden. The spring air was gentle, but nothing could stop the tears from running down my face. I was thankful in a strange way that no one else was around, grateful for the privacy to grieve without the weight of sympathetic stares. Inside that building, my husband Callum lay in a hospital bed. My Callum, my rock, my protector. It felt unreal. Just a short time ago he had been full of life, the kind of man who made the world feel steady, safe. With him, every storm in life felt like a passing shower. But now, seeing him so fragile, his skin pale, eyes sunken, voice barely more than a whisper, it felt like watching the strongest tree slowly lose all its leaves. I held on to hope at first. I really did. I told myself he'd pull through, that he was just tired, that medicine would work. But slowly, reality began to sink in. I remember the words of Dr. Reeves as if they were carved into stone. Start preparing yourselves. Those words still haunt me. The illness is advancing quickly. The treatments aren't responding the way we'd hoped. His condition is declining, and we haven't received any matches from the transplant registry. The backlog is overwhelming. You want to hear something cruel? Before this, Callum never needed a doctor. He was the picture of health, rarely even caught a cold. Broad-shouldered, tall, full of energy. I used to look at him, his golden hair, those shining teeth, that boyish smile, and imagine what beautiful kids we'd have together. I never doubted for a second that he came from strong, healthy stock. But his past, that was something he never had full clarity on. He grew up in an orphanage. No birthdays with family, no old photos. When he finally started asking questions, most people gave him silence. Until one day, a nurse told him what little she knew. His mother, a tall, striking woman, had struggled with alcohol. She already had a house full of children and no partner to lean on. When Callum was born, she left him at the hospital, believing it was the kindest thing she could do. My Callum was never adopted. He grew up in that children's home. But you know something? He never complained when he told me about his childhood. It wasn't in his nature to lament. He preferred to look at the bright side of things. But I, who knew him so well, could read between the lines. It had been difficult, the rare sweets that children shared, the harsh manner of the caretakers. Even so, my dear, my Callum became the gentlest and most sensitive man I've ever known. We met by chance, you know. It was 1978, and I worked as a clothing salesperson at a local fashion store. That day, after a busy week of work, my colleagues and I decided to go to a community church festival to relax a bit. That day, I was feeling beautiful. I had put on my new prairie-style floral dress that my mother had sewn for me. I noticed the glances from the young men. You know how it is. The place was lively with music playing through the speakers, people dancing, everyone laughing and chatting around the booth. Some of my friends were invited to dance. Well, first came a much older gentleman. I politely declined. Then appeared the cocky young man who acted like he was doing me a favor by asking me to dance. I preferred to stay with my friends rather than put up with that type. As the night was coming to an end, I found myself alone near the ring toss booth for a moment. That's when he appeared. Callum was dressed simply in a chambray shirt and corduroy pants, but with that blonde hair neatly combed and the most beautiful green eyes I'd ever seen. His smile, my God, was breathtaking. It had a hint of shyness, but it captivated me instantly. I smiled back and he approached. "Would you like to try your luck at the ring toss?" he asked, already extending a ring to me. "Of course," I replied, unable to wipe the smile from my face. My dear, Callum had a sincerity that was like a breath of fresh air. He was different from all the other young men. Being with him was so natural, so easy. "My name is Callum," he said. "May I know yours?" And so began a conversation that flowed as if we had known each other for years. "Elaine," I answered, feeling that I could be completely myself with him. We talked as if the world around us didn't exist. There wasn't that discomfort, the tension when you're getting to know someone new. It was as if we already had a connection from other lives. When my friends returned, all giggly and looking at Callum with that interested expression, he was super polite with them. But you know what caught my attention? He didn't pay the slightest attention to Bryn's attempts to get his attention. His eyes were fixed on me. Then a slow song started playing on the loudspeaker, one of those really romantic ones. Callum invited me to dance right there near the bandstand. Girl, what an attentive, respectful man in a way I had never seen before. In his arms, it was as if the whole world had disappeared, and only the two of us existed. I didn't even know how to dance properly, but with him, it seemed like I was born knowing. At that moment, I didn't know anything about his past, about what he did for a living. But I felt, I felt that he was trustworthy, that he was a good person. You could see it in his eyes. Suddenly he said he needed to help at the homemade pie booth where he had promised to lend a hand, but he promised he would return. He asked me to wait for him near the bandstand. Oh, how anxious I was. I wanted so much for him to return so we could continue that connection that had just been born. The night went on. My friends continued having fun at the booth, but my mind was only thinking about Callum. Each minute that passed without him returning was torture. I was torn between worry and anger. Had something happened to him, or had he found another girl? We hadn't even exchanged addresses, nothing, just that promise hanging in the air that he would return. My heart was tight, I wanted so much for him to appear again. My mysterious admirer had vanished, and I found myself looking everywhere, all the time, hoping to see that shy smile again. Oh, my dear, let me tell you what happened next. Bryn, so observant, noticed my sadness and asked with that sympathetic voice, "You liked him, didn't you, Elaine?" I foolishly tried to hide it. I responded dismissively, "Not at all. He wasn't anything special, just another guy. There are plenty like him out there." But my heart was saying something else. Then Marcos, wanting to join the conversation, said, "There are many guys out there, but you're Elaine." I think he was trying to cheer me up, Oh, my dear, let me tell you about that night after Callum disappeared. My friends were all excited to go to Finch's Tavern. Sloane, always full of energy, insisted we go, saying the night was still young. But I, even with all that festival excitement still in my body, had to decline. I explained to the girls that it was getting late and my parents wouldn't like it if I came home after hours. You know how it was back then, right? We respected our parents. It wasn't like today when people come and go as they please. Well, not everyone respected as they should, but that was their problem and their families, not mine. The girls were a bit disappointed but understood. Bryn even told me to be careful on the way back. I walked home, feeling the cool night breeze. When I was getting close, I saw Flynn and Wren playing in the street. They were my younger siblings, always energetic, those two, and with them, our dogs, Scout and Daisy, running and barking, all excited with the neighbors' children. I started calling from a distance. "Flynn, Wren, let's go home for dinner. Come on, come on. Scout, Daisy, come here." They didn't even want to stop playing. If I let them, they would have stayed out until dawn. I had to insist. Come on, you two. It's time. The dogs came running, jumping on me all happy. When the children came close, I saw they were all dirty and sweaty. They wanted to give me a hug, but I refused. Don't even think about it. Go take a bath first, then I'll give you a kiss. We entered the house with Scout and Daisy running ahead, barking and wagging their tails. The light in my mother's studio was still on. You know, my mother was a freelance fashion designer, and her studio was an improvised room inside the house, but that's where the magic happened with her fairy hands. I peeked in, and there she was, focused, sewing a beautiful dress. My mother was famous in the neighborhood. Everyone came to her asking to make clothes. People were always saying that Gwendolyn Mercer worked miracles with a needle, and it was true. I had so many exclusive clothes made by her that my friends were even envious. They said they looked like clothes from fancy boutiques. In the kitchen, I smelled that delicious aroma. My father was there preparing dinner, and what good food, my goodness. When he saw me, he opened that big smile, called me princess all happily, and said he was starting to worry because I was late. I was so touched. My father always got all soft when I arrived. I explained that the festival was lively and gave him a kiss on the cheek. He said he was happy that I had enjoyed myself and told everyone to take a bath while dinner was getting ready. Scout and Daisy kept circling around the kitchen, hoping something would fall on the floor. I went to my room, thinking about how that night had been, the festival, the dances, the conversations with friends, and of course, that nice young man who had appeared. But at that moment, with the smell of my father's cooking, the little noise of my mother's vintage Singer sewing machine, the commotion of my siblings taking a bath, and the happy barking of Scout and Daisy, I felt at peace. Whatever was going to happen, I had my safe harbor right there in that simple little house, with my family that I loved so much, and that, my dear, was priceless. After that night at the festival, I spent a few days thinking about Callum. You know how it is. But look at this twist of fate. The following week, I was going to work, and who do I meet on the street? Yes, Callum. Girl, my heart nearly jumped out of my mouth. He opened that beautiful smile and came to talk to me. He apologized for disappearing at the festival, explained that he had a problem with a friend, and when he returned, he couldn't find me anymore. He said he had been looking for me the rest of the night. We stood there on the sidewalk, talking as if the world had stopped. I ended up arriving late to work that day, but it was worth every minute. Before we parted, Callum invited me for coffee on Sunday after Mass, and that's how it began, my dear. From that coffee on, we started seeing each other more often. He would wait for me at the store exit. Sometimes we would take walks around the square, talking about everything and anything. With time, Callum told me more about his life. At first, I confess, I was a bit scared by some things he told me. But you know what? All that he went through without having parents around actually made him a stronger man. Callum understood that the only way to change his life was by studying. And look what a beautiful thing. His teachers noticed the boy's effort and began to help, giving extra attention. He always spoke very fondly of his physics teacher. He said that one day, when he became rich and famous, he would thank that teacher in a special way. With all this effort, Callum achieved something that seemed almost impossible, a scholarship to a top university. But don't think it was easy. The competition was fierce. There were very few scholarships and many good people wanting them. The requirements were very high, excellent grades, and you had to prove you really needed the financial help, which wasn't difficult since he grew up in the children's home. The worst part was that hardly anyone knew exactly how this scholarship business worked. It wasn't like today, where information is everywhere. If it hadn't been for that physics teacher who told Callum, he wouldn't even have known about the opportunity. But Callum dedicated himself like never before. He spent nights studying, barely slept. On the day of the scholarship exam, he left home while it was still dark. When the results came out, It was pure joy. Among so many good students, he had stood out and secured one of the few scholarships. And wouldn't you know, he soon became one of the best students at the university, but don't think it was easy. While studying, he also worked odd jobs to support himself. We were the same age, Callum and I, 22 years old. When he turned 18, they told him he needed to leave the children's home. So he rented a carriage house apartment behind the home of a widowed gentleman, Mr. Abernathy. They talked a lot, but look, for all he had already lived through and learning in life, he seemed much older than me. I, still living with my parents, felt almost like a little girl next to him. But you know what I realized? Callum, with all that caring and sensitive way of his, what he wanted most was to be loved and accepted. I think because he didn't have that when he was a child, he really valued genuine feelings, people's kindness. After Callum graduated in architecture, one night he surprised me by asking for my hand in marriage. It was so emotional. He had already won over my entire family. My mother was always saying, "What a handsome young man with a good heart. He's been through so much, but has a bright future ahead." My father also liked him very much. He said Callum wasn't just any young man, but a real man with goals in life. Our wedding was simple but full of love. My mother, with those fairy hands of hers, made my wedding dress. It was beautiful. The celebration was just for the closest people. At my parents' house, Callum had saved every penny from his first salaries as an architect, and we did the best we could with what we had. After getting married, we went to live in that simple carriage house apartment behind Mr. Abernathy's house. It was small, but to us, it was a palace. Thank God my mother had taught me everything about taking care of a house. I knew how to cook, wash, iron, sew, everything a good housewife needed to know. My mother used to say since I was little that I was very hard-working. She said this because my calves were very thin. Callum was impressed with my domestic skills. We learned to value every moment together, knowing that with or without children, we were already a family. I was determined to have a child, whatever it took, but Callum, always so attentive, was getting worried. One night, after another disappointment, after more than a year of trying, he came close to me and gently said it was time to take a break. At first I was confused. "What do you mean, stop?" I couldn't understand. Callum explained that we should enjoy life, enjoy each other without thinking only about this. Deep down, I was also exhausted, tired of having hope every month and then being disappointed, tired of so much worry. "But what about the dream of having children?" I asked. "What about the children?" And Callum, with that way of his, said we could adopt a child from the children's home. But I quickly replied that I wanted to have my own children. I even said, who knows where the children in the children's home come from? Callum was quiet for a moment, then remembered that he too was from a children's home. That hit me in my heart. I didn't want to hurt him. He continued, saying it was okay if I didn't want a child from someone else, that he wouldn't insist, but he also didn't want to see me suffering anymore. At that moment, Callum seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. After all, there was no way to know if it was me or him who couldn't have children. And so it went, but things began to change. Callum, who had always been full of energy, started getting tired easily. He would come home from work and go straight to bed or just sit in the armchair listening to the radio. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was just work fatigue, but it became more and more frequent. Soon he was coming home pale, breathless, completely exhausted. His appetite worsened, and he started losing weight rapidly. What scared me most was when bruises began appearing on his body for no apparent reason. That wasn't normal, and I began to get really worried. I insisted that he needed to see a doctor. I had even made an appointment and told him not to dare miss it. Callum smiled and said he was already planning to go soon. I was worried about my husband, but I was certain that nothing serious was happening. I thought the doctors would diagnose some vitamin deficiency, prescribe some medicine, suggest some walks. Maybe we would spend a few days at the beach to rest and everything would be fine. However, we weren't prepared. Callum was diagnosed with leukemia by the doctor at the city hospital. The doctor explained that it was a type of cancer in the blood. At that time, hearing the word cancer was like receiving a death sentence. We barely understood what it was, only knew it was a terrible disease. When the news spread, people began to look at us differently. Some neighbors even stayed away as if cancer was contagious. That hurt us a lot. My parents were devastated. My father, even being a simple man, couldn't accept it. He asked everyone if they knew a doctor who could help better, who knew of some new treatment. That's when the priest of our parish mentioned Dr. Reeves, who sometimes gave free consultations at the church. He had a reputation for knowing the most modern treatments. When Dr. Reeves saw Callum, he confirmed what we already knew, but talked about some new research they were doing abroad. He mentioned a treatment called chemotherapy that was very strong and dangerous. The protocols were more aggressive and the side effects more intense than current treatments due to the side effects and high toxicity of the medications used, but sometimes it worked. He also mentioned something called bone marrow transplant, but it was still very experimental. Callum, brave as always, said he wanted to try everything possible. I was afraid. The idea of losing him terrified me, but at the same time, any chance was better than none. We knew it would be a difficult fight. I spent nights awake praying, thinking about everything we had lived through and the future we dreamed of. It was hard to see Callum, always so strong, now weak and worn down. But even so, he tried to cheer me up. He said we would win this battle. Our life turned upside down, you know? Callum's disease worsened quickly and he had to be hospitalized. I practically moved to the hospital, only going home to shower and change clothes. I slept in a chair next to his bed. I didn't want to leave him alone for even a minute. My parents offered to take turns with me. I accepted, of course. In the few hours I spent at home, I slept on Callum's side of the bed, covered myself with his patchwork quilt, wore his clothes. It was a way of feeling close even when far away. Dr. Reeves explained to me better about the new treatment, bone marrow transplant. He said it was Callum's only chance, but it was difficult to find a compatible donor. Since Callum was from a children's home, he had no relatives to take the test. I said to him, if we had managed to have a child, maybe... But he explained to me that bone marrow donation by children was generally not recommended because it was a procedure with risks like infections, bleeding, and other complications. For a child, this risk could be even greater because their body is developing and might be more sensitive to the effects of surgery and anesthesia, so I breathed a little easier since that wasn't the case. One night, after a tiring day at the hospital, I was leaving. I stopped near the hospital to dry my tears before catching the bus. That's when I heard two nurses talking. I recognized them from the floor where Callum was hospitalized. One of them said she felt sorry for Callum. I froze. The other agreed, saying he was a good and gentle young man, but it was clear he wasn't going to last much longer, that he was getting worse each day. I felt my heart tighten. I almost came out of my hiding place to argue with them, to tell them they were wrong, that Callum was going to get better. But my legs went weak. I had to lean against the wall. I went home that night completely devastated. The words of those nurses wouldn't leave my head. It was as if they had confirmed my greatest fear, but I couldn't give up. Callum needed me to be strong, and I was going to fight for him until the end. Ah, my dear, this reminds me of the nights I spent kneeling beside the hospital bed. Every night before sleeping, I prayed with all the strength of my heart. I asked God for a sign, you know. I wanted him to prepare me for what was to come for my Callum. It was difficult, but I said, Lord, if it is your will to take my beloved, give me strength to accept. Sometimes my voice would catch in my throat. Tears would flow, but I continued asking. I wanted to be ready for whatever God had planned, even if it was to say goodbye to the love of my life. It wasn't easy, but faith gave me a strength I didn't know I had. And that night at home was no different. I knelt in front of Callum's side of the bed and again asked God for a sign. For the first time in a long time, I fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. I had such a vivid dream that upon waking I wished I could return to it. In the dream, we lived in a cozy house in a charming little town. I was walking through a verdant meadow, wearing a pretty summer dress, carrying a basket full of cornbread, preserves and berries. In the distance, I saw Callum working in a field harvesting hay. Then I heard a child's voice shouting, "Mommy, wait for me!" A small girl of about 3 or 4 years ran from the house in my direction, laughing. She wore a little hat and a summer dress, her delicate face beaming with joy as she ran across the field. Callum appeared, pretending to chase her. The girl laughed louder and ran faster. I opened my arms, calling her to hurry. The girl ran into my arms. Callum arrived, trying to lift both of us, but tripped, and we all fell on the grass, laughing. It was such a beautiful dream that I didn't want to wake up, but I had rested enough and woke up. For the first time since learning about my beloved's serious illness, I felt renewed energy. The dream had cheered me up, even if just for a moment. I grabbed some fruit and went to visit Callum. He was too weak to sit up in bed, but he still managed to greet me with a smile and a wink. "You seem especially cheerful today," he observed, looking at me. "I'm just in a good mood," I replied, sitting beside him and holding his hand, which he squeezed weakly. I was eager to tell him about my dream, but was afraid it might be too much for him at that moment. So I decided to hold back. As Callum fell asleep, I continued holding his hand, looking at his peaceful face while silent tears ran down my face. Leaving the hospital around noon, I felt the need to take a walk and breathe some fresh air. As I walked, my thoughts turned to the uncertain future and the painful realization that I might never have children with my Callum. I remembered the conversations we had about having children and what Callum once said about children in children's homes. Suddenly I stopped. An idea hit me like lightning. I felt something different, as if I had found a purpose. I ran back home. As soon as I arrived, I grabbed my phone book and went to knock on Mr. Abernathy's door, the owner of the front house where we were tenants. I asked to borrow his phone, explaining it was urgent. I started calling various children's homes, explaining my situation. There weren't many nearby, but one of them invited me for a visit the next day. I arrived very early at the children's home. The children were still sleeping, so I couldn't meet them at first. But Mrs. Holloway, the director of the adoption center, explained that adoption normally took a long time, sometimes years. I said I was ready to adopt any child, that I really wanted to be a mother and give Callum the chance to be a father, even if for a short time. Mrs. Holloway began to explain that the process was quite bureaucratic and time-consuming. There was extensive documentation to be presented, in addition to interviews and rigorous social investigations. She also said there were strict criteria for adoption applicants, and they were quite rigid. It was common to require couples to be married for at least 5 years, to have a minimum age, and to prove financial stability. But Mrs. Holloway understood our special situation and said she would try to speed up the process. Though she won't, it would still take a few months at minimum. I accepted. There was no other way. As I walked through the corridors, I saw that the children had woken up and were playing outside. My heart filled with joy seeing them. But when I reached the gate, my eyes stopped on one particular girl. This girl was identical to the child I had seen in my dream. I was paralyzed, feeling a strange shiver. Mrs. Holloway noticed my fixed gaze and asked if everything was all right. I, still recovering from the shock, took a while to respond. I looked at her, not quite understanding the question. I said everything was fine and asked if I could go talk to that girl. I pointed to the child. Mrs. Holloway, with a warm smile, agreed. I approached the girl, who was engrossed in playing with her cloth dolls. When I got close, she looked up and greeted me with a smile. I returned the smile and complimented her dolls. "I love your dolls," I said to the little girl. She, all happy, began to tell me about each of her little dolls and the stories she invented. She even had one where a doll was sad because her friend was going away. Mrs. Holloway came close and whispered to me about Piper. Poor little thing, her mother had problems with alcohol and an easy life. You know? That's why the little one had been in the children's home for a long time. Mrs. Holloway said people were afraid to adopt a child with a father or mother who drank. I learned that Piper had already seen many children leave, but no one wanted to take her. The little one's sadness wasn't even for herself. It was because her little friends were leaving. That broke my heart. Mrs. Holloway saw my face and said she would do everything for the adoption. In the days that followed, it seemed like time wasn't passing. I kept waiting for news, imagining how I would tell my Callum. "Ah, my dear, let me tell you something I found out later. You know this adoption process? Well, it's not easy. I discovered they went after every reference. You can't even imagine. They went to the parish we attended to talk with Father Paul and the church people. They went to my father and mother's house to interview them. Poor things must have been nervous. At Callum's work too, they talked with his colleagues, with his boss, everyone. And look, they even went to the university where Callum studied, talked even with his professors from years ago. Imagine that. That's why it takes months. I was amazed when I found out all this. We don't even realize, but they investigate our lives from top to bottom before letting us adopt a child. It's a very serious process, but I understand, right? They want to make sure the child goes to a good home with good people. When I think about all this, it even moves me. So many people talking about us, telling our story. It's as if our entire lives had prepared us to receive Piper, you know? God writes straight with crooked lines, doesn't he? In that routine, I had gone to visit Callum in the hospital as I always did. When I returned home, I saw Mr. Abernathy standing at the gate. He had an anxious look, as if he had been waiting for a long time. As soon as he saw me, he waved all excited. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm so glad you're back," he shouted from the gate. I went to him, hurrying my steps, curious to know what was so important. "Mrs. Mercer, they called from the children's home while you were out," he said, almost unable to contain his excitement. "They asked you to call back as soon as possible. It seems like it's good news." My heart jumped. Could it be what I was waiting for? Mr. Abernathy, poor thing, was almost as anxious as I was. He was a widower, you know, and always rooted to see us happy. He stood looking at me with that face of someone who wanted to know more. "Thank you very much, Mr. Abernathy," I said, already turning to enter. "You don't know the good you've done me." I ran inside and went straight to the phone. I called the children's home with trembling hands. When Mrs. Holloway answered and gave me the news, I almost fell backward with joy. I ran out again, passing Mr. Abernathy, who was behind me listening to everything with a broad smile. "Is it good news, Mrs. Mercer?" he asked. "Yes, Mr. Abernathy," I replied, almost crying with joy. "It's the best news in the world." And off I went, hurrying to the children's home to get my Piper. Mr. Abernathy stood there smiling, happy to see that something good was happening. He was a good man, you know, the kind you don't find much anymore these days. When Callum was hospitalized, Mr. Abernathy wouldn't accept our rent money anymore. He saw that Callum and I were living with my mother at the time, realized we were having financial difficulties, and suggested I go live with her. But Mr. Abernathy almost begged me to stay there with him, saying he would help us by offering to waive the rent until the day our lives returned to normal. I accepted because I saw that he didn't want to lose contact with us. He had 4 children, all married, and received visits from them practically only on Father's Day and Christmas. Poor thing, he didn't deserve that. I arrived at the children's home with my heart in my throat. Mrs. Holloway took me to where Piper was. When I saw her sitting in a corner playing with dolls, my heart nearly jumped out of my mouth. I knelt beside her and said we could go get ice cream. Her eyes lit up. Children are all the same, aren't they? She nodded, her smile growing bigger. I extended my hand to her, and after a moment, her little hand held mine. It was as if we had made a deal without saying anything. When we left the children's home, I felt Piper squeezing my hand a little tighter. You could see she was excited but also afraid of this new life. I explained to her that she could call me Mom or just Elaine, whatever she wanted. Piper smiled but stayed quiet. I told her about Callum, that he was sick. On the way to the hospital, we kept talking. It seemed like I had been her mother forever, you know? The conversation was going so well. Arriving at the hospital, I entered Callum's room with my heart racing. I was nervous, but full of hope. I led Piper by the hand to his bed. Callum was there, weak, but when he opened his eyes and saw me and the girl, he had a look of astonishment. "Who is this, Elaine?" he asked, his voice weak but curious. I took a deep breath, my eyes full of tears, and introduced them. "Callum, this is our daughter, Piper. Piper, this is Callum, your father." Callum was surprised, looking from me to Piper, who was standing there all shy, but with a sparkle in her eyes. The room fell into silence, everyone not knowing what to do. And then Callum's face grew calmer as he looked at Piper. "Hi, Piper," he said kindly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Piper, seeing his manner, came closer to the bed. Callum extended his hand to her, weak but with a smile on his face. It was a moment I will never forget. Afterward, I took her to our home. It was strange not to stay there with Callum, but now I had to take care of the girl too. My mother would soon arrive to spend the night with him. When we were leaving the hospital, Piper suddenly became quiet. Then she said softly, "His name isn't Callum." I was confused and asked, "What do you mean, dear?" "The man in the hospital. He has another name," she replied. That worried me. To distract the girl, I said that the next day we would go to my parents' house. I told her she would meet my siblings and that my parents already knew about her and were eager to see her. Now, my dear, let me tell you about that special day when Piper arrived at home. It was such a beautiful thing that even today I get emotional just remembering. We were arriving and Mr. Abernathy, poor thing, must have heard the noise of the gate. He suddenly appeared, all anxious to meet Piper. He looked at her with eyes full of tears and said she could call him Grandpa. It was so beautiful to see. He was so lonely that he always got emotional. He invited us in. He had made homemade bread. The table was all set, so of course we didn't refuse. We stayed there talking for a long time. Later we went to our carriage house apartment in the back. You know we didn't have a room just for her, right? She was going to sleep on the sofa bed in the kitchen. It was kind of a kitchen living room combined, you know how it is. But Piper, little angel, seemed not to mind. She settled in as if she had known the place for ages. Later, I made a little dinner for us. Girl, you should have seen how Piper ate with gusto. After dinner, she took a bath. You know, I had wanted a child for so long. I was so happy I could barely contain myself. When it was time to sleep, I explained to her that in our house, we always pray before lying down. I asked her to kneel with me, and we said a prayer together. She stayed quiet, paying attention. I prayed aloud so she could learn. Then I asked if she wanted to sleep on the sofa or in bed with me on Callum's side. You know what she chose? She wanted to stay close to me. She lay down right by my side, and I felt she was beginning to feel at home. That night, lying there with my Piper by my side, I thanked God so much. I looked at her sleeping and thought, this is it. Now we are a real family. The next day, I dressed Piper very nicely to meet my parents. When we arrived, my mother was still at the hospital, so my father opened the door with tears in his eyes. I saw him trying to hide his emotion. "This is Piper," I said, gently pushing the girl forward. My father immediately knelt down. "How beautiful you are, my little granddaughter," he said with an emotional voice. Then my father cleared his throat and said, "Welcome to the family, little one." Piper, all shy, gave a little smile. My siblings appeared too, making a fuss. Wren even brought a gift, a new doll for her. I left Piper there getting acquainted with the family and went to the children's home. I needed to talk to Mrs. Holloway. I took the bus and arrived there almost breathless. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to know more about Piper's past," I said as soon as I saw her. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer, but I cannot give that kind of information," I begged. "Mrs. Holloway, it's a matter of life and death for my husband. It seems she knows him. You don't understand. Something strange is happening." And so I told her what happened at the hospital. Mrs. Holloway looked at me for a while. You could see she was thinking. Then I decided to tell her I would pay for the information if necessary. She became quite upset. "That offends me," she said. After a sigh, she said, "All right, Mrs. Mercer. I'll tell you what I know, but this stays just between us. I risk losing my job, but if it's a matter of life and death, I'll tell you." I stood there, on edge, waiting for her to speak. Mrs. Holloway sighed deeply and began, "Look, Mrs. Mercer, it's not much that I know. Piper's parents, from what I was told, had serious problems with alcohol. They were always drunk, you know. One day, a neighbor brought the girl here. He said he couldn't stand to see the child suffering anymore. We needed to know if what this neighbor was saying was true. When we arrived at the address he had left us, we immediately confirmed that he was telling the truth." "And this neighbor? Do you know who he is?" I asked anxiously. Mrs. Holloway hesitated a bit, but ended up saying, "Yes, I do. His name is Griffin. I even have his address noted here." When she gave me the address, I almost couldn't believe it. It was in a small town a few hours from there. The next day, I left Piper with my parents and went looking for this Griffin. The place, God help me, was all abandoned. There was even a deposit of old junk nearby. I stopped in front of the house and clapped my hands. "Hello, anybody home?" And nothing, nobody answered. I gathered my courage and opened the gate. I went to the porch and saw that the door was unlocked. I knocked hard. Suddenly I heard a voice from inside. "Come in. Can't you see the door is open?" I thought the owner was expecting visitors and went in. What a sad house. Smell of mildew, dust everywhere, furniture all broken, things thrown all over the place. Suddenly I heard footsteps. A man appeared in the doorway. When I looked at him, I almost fell backward. The man's face took my breath away in surprise. He had the same features as my Callum, the same eyes, the same cheekbones, the same curve of the eyebrows, even a mark on the neck. The resemblance was astonishing, but you could see his life had been harder. His eyes were red, full of wrinkles on his face, burnt by the sun, and a poorly kept beard. "And who are you?" he asked, not rudely, just curious. I didn't know what to say, so I said that maybe it would be better to show a photo of my husband. He shrugged and came closer. Up close, the resemblance to Callum was even more impressive. I stood looking, fascinated. "You're staring at me too much. Can you tell me what's going on?" he asked directly. "It's a long and complicated story," I replied, trying to smile. "Looking at you now, I have no doubt. You and my husband are identical." I extended the photo for him to take. Griffin looked at Callum's photo carefully. His hands trembled a little, but he tried not to show it. "Did you know you had a brother?" I asked, hoping he was indeed Callum's relative and could save him from the disease. "I knew," replied Griffin, nodding slowly. His eyes shone with tears. "But I never thought I would find him." Griffin paused a bit and said, sit here in this chair, as if controlling himself, and began to tell his story. My God in heaven, what a terrible situation. My dear, it breaks your heart. He said that at the time he was barely 8 years old, but he was already the only man in the family. His half-sisters kept reminding him of this, making him clean and even cook when he was only 5 or 6 years old. There was no father in the family. His mother, Maeve, was a woman of easy virtue, if you understand me. She probably didn't even remember who was the father of whom, with so many men passing through there. Life was difficult for Griffin, with his mother always altered by drink, the house full of strange people, and the older sisters mistreating him. Griffin told me that his mother, Maeve, turned a blind eye when the men who came to the house took advantage of the older girls, all for a few coins. And you know something horrible? With time, the girls ended up falling into that life too. But then they got angry with their mother. They no longer gave her money or anything. They became rebellious, and rightly so. Maeve complained, "These ungrateful ones, after all I did for them, now they don't help me with anything." You could see that Griffin suffered telling this. He was tiny at the time, but he remembered everything. He said he wanted to run away, make a hut in the woods just to get away from that whole situation. Then Maeve got pregnant again. She complained all the time, "Where am I going to find space for another mouth? I'm not even going to pick up this newborn from the maternity ward. I'll just write a refusal and that's it." Griffin, even as a child, was terrified by the idea of a baby being left out there. He was sure that this time it would be a boy, a little brother for him. I could barely speak. He continued telling his story, and my heart got tighter and tighter. He said that growing up among the sisters made him really want a brother. He said he would teach his little brother everything boys like: fishing, making wood sculptures with a little knife, climbing trees, playing jacks and marbles. The two would understand each other like no one else. Griffin would no longer feel alone in that house full of people. "Mother, don't leave the baby, please." Griffin begged almost every day. If Maeve was in a good mood, she would laugh and joke. If she was in a bad mood, she would even hit him for insisting, pulling his ears until they were raw. When the time came, Maeve returned home thinner, more willing after a week without drinking, and empty-handed. Griffin looked at his mother and felt tears burning in his eyes. In the end, she had indeed abandoned his little brother. The boy would be sent to a children's home or to a good family, never knowing he had a brother who dreamed and waited so much for him. Griffin cried with pain, with despair at not being able to change anything. At this point, I was crying like a child with so much pity. Griffin continued telling, and each word of his was like a stab in my heart. Years went by, Mrs. Mercer. I stayed there at home, managing as best I could. Mother drank more and more, and there was something even worse that Mother did. I heard her talking and saw her doing it. She got pregnant other times, you know, but she learned to get rid of the baby before it started growing in her belly. She would take a moonshine tonic and then almost die of pain, writhing all over. So Callum was the last baby she actually had. My God, I simply couldn't believe the atrocities I was hearing. He didn't stop there. He continued. My sisters had already disappeared into the world a long time ago. When I was 12, a woman from social services appeared. She said my mother was no longer able to take care of me. Right then I thought, how long it took them to realize that. Poor Griffin. They took me to a children's home. At first I was scared, but later, you know, I even liked it. There were clean clothes, food on time, people who really looked after me, and what I liked most of all were the friends I made. I was never adopted. I stayed there until I was 18. When I left, I found out that my mother had died of liver cirrhosis due to drinking. No one knew about my sisters. I returned to this old house that was abandoned, falling apart. I was shocked by everything. I had never heard such barbarities, you know, my dear. I tried to start a new life, he continued. I found some odd jobs here and there, but it was difficult, you understand. Without education, without anyone to give a hand, I managed as best I could. I would mow gardens, cut firewood, that kind of thing. You know, my dear, I kept wondering how such a thing could happen. There I was, wanting so much to have a child, praying every day, and God wouldn't give me one. Yet that woman, Maeve, who didn't care at all about her own children, was constantly being gifted with babies in her womb. It was something to think about. And it wasn't just her. The children's homes are always full, you know. So many people having children without being able to raise them, without wanting to raise them. It's too sad to see all these children left without a real home. But now I understand that God had a greater plan. He knew that Piper would need me, and I would need her. Sometimes we don't understand the Lord's ways at the time, but in the end, everything fits together. After hearing all that from Griffin, I felt my heart tighten. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears, and began to tell my part. Ah, Griffin, life takes such turns that we can't even imagine. Callum did grow up in the children's home. He lived there until he was 18, just like you. Certainly, you didn't meet each other because the children's home he was taken to was in the capital. Since I married Callum, we dreamed of having children, but the years went by and nothing happened. It was just sadness. One day, Callum suggested that I adopt a child. At first, I didn't want to know. I thought it wouldn't be the same thing. Then one night, I had a dream. I dreamed of a little girl calling me Mom. I woke up crying. I felt in my heart that it was an answer from God to my prayers. When I arrived there, I saw Piper. That little girl, I'll tell you, looked like an angel. I looked into her eyes and felt she was my daughter. I didn't think twice. I started the adoption process right away. When I had spoken the name Piper, I saw on his face that he knew her. His expression changed, but he was waiting for me to tell everything. Well, and my Callum, your brother, poor thing, is there in the hospital fighting against this cursed disease, leukemia. It's a type of cancer. The doctor said he needs a transplant of bone marrow, you know. Relatives, especially siblings, have a greater probability of being compatible for donating bone marrow. That's because they share part of the genetic material, increasing the chances. He widened his eyes as if to say, I can donate. It's only been a day since Piper has been with me. I took her to the hospital to meet Callum, and that's when, Griffin, something happened that left me dumbfounded. Piper looked at Callum and then said he wasn't called Callum, that he had another name. I was so intrigued by that I started digging, you know. And look where I ended up, here at your door. When I finished speaking, I saw that Griffin had watery eyes again. He stood there, trying to understand this crazy story I was telling. Mrs. Mercer, he began, you adopted little Piper. The truth is, I am Piper's uncle. Her mother, my sister Sienna, she came back to the house when I was already living here. She was pretty, but led a life that wasn't good, you know. She didn't even care about the girl. Even with the sad end of my mother, she was following the same path of alcohol. One day, she disappeared into the world with some man, leaving poor Piper with me as if she were an old package. Since I had grown up in a children's home, you know, I believed it was a good place, that they would take good care of her, better than staying with me, who barely had enough to eat, not to mention that I would go to work, and she would have to stay alone. It weighed on my heart, but the best I could do was take her there. I didn't want to take her to the children's home where I grew up. I took her there to the capital. The little one was about 3.5 at the time. How does the little rascal remember my face? Mrs. Holloway, who was in charge, seemed like a good person, so I said I was a neighbor who couldn't stand to see the girl suffering anymore. I left the address of this house for her. One day they came here. I hid in the back. They saw that there was no one and left. Then I saw them from a distance talking with Mr. Reynolds, the neighbor, and he certainly said that this house here wasn't in any condition for a child to live in. But my initial plan was to go there from time to time to know if she had been adopted, you know. I did that thinking of her well-being, Mrs. Mercer. But every day I thought about my niece, wondering if I had done the right thing. When he said this, I was speechless. That man had given up raising his niece, all to give her a better chance. My heart was so tight, I can't even say. The tears were already flowing freely down his face. I was so moved by the story that I got up, took his hand, and gave him a tight hug. Griffin, you did a great job. Piper is a wonderful girl and will be our daughter thanks to you. As I said this, I felt my eyes filling with tears again. What a sad story, my God. Ah, my dear, that moment was so emotional, such a tremendous revelation. I felt the presence of God that still gives me goosebumps just remembering. After I told everything to Griffin, we stayed there trying to compose ourselves. Let me tell you exactly how it was afterward. After I explained everything to Griffin about Callum's disease and the urgent need for the transplant, he was surprised but didn't hesitate. When can I meet him? Griffin asked, all anxious to help. Right now, if you can, I said. Callum is in the hospital and every minute counts. I hope it's not inconvenient for you. Griffin responded immediately. Of course it's not inconvenient. Let me just change quickly and I'll go with you to the hospital. I want to meet my brother and do whatever is necessary to help him. I was so moved by his willingness. While Griffin went to get ready, I sat thinking about how to tell Callum. My heart was pounding. We took a bus. I had to pay for his ticket. He didn't have a penny. Arriving at the hospital, before entering the room, I explained to Griffin that Callum still didn't know anything. I asked him to wait a little outside while I prepared my husband for the news. When I entered the room, my father was there with Callum. When he saw me, he opened that beautiful smile, even being so weak. "Hey dear, you took a while," he said, looking beside me and saying, "Where is our little Piper?" I began to speak very slowly. "I have incredible news for you. I think I found a possible donor." His eyes widened immediately. I continued telling everything from the beginning. I spoke of Piper, of when we left the hospital that day, that she said Callum wasn't Callum, that he was another man. That's when I started running after it, you know, and I can't believe what I discovered. Callum, you have a brother, and he's here, right out there, waiting to meet you. The room fell into silence. Callum and my father looked at each other, not knowing what to say. "Can I call him to come in?" I asked, my heart in my hand. Callum nodded, still unable to speak. I went to the door and called Griffin. When Griffin entered, it was as if time stopped. He looked at Callum, his eyes full of emotion, and said, "Good afternoon, Callum. I'm Griffin, your brother." The rest you can imagine. It was such a beautiful, such a wonderful moment that even today I get emotional just remembering. Seeing those two meeting without even knowing of each other's existence. Ah, my dear, it was like seeing a miracle happening right in front of me. I still didn't have confirmation that he could be the donor my husband needed, but I, with my unwavering faith, felt it deep in my being. I knew that God had placed Piper and Griffin in our lives for a reason. Ah, my dear, let me tell you a story that always moves me when I remember. Dr. Reeves and his team called Griffin to do some tests, take a little blood. We were in that anxiety, you know, everyone praying with a tight heart, hoping it would work out, and girl, it did. Griffin was the perfect donor for Callum. When the doctor gave the news, it was a joy you can't imagine. We hugged, cried, gave thanks. It seemed like the weight of the world had been lifted from our shoulders. Then began all that preparation for the surgery. Things at that time were a bit different from what you see today. Griffin had to stay hospitalized for a whole day because they would take the marrow from his hip bone. Poor thing had an annoying pain afterward, but he hardly complained. Just knowing he was going to help his brother, he was already happy as could be. He didn't care about anything else. Now Callum, ah, my dear, he stayed longer in the hospital. The surgery was long, and we were outside the whole time, praying with faith. When it was over, the doctor came to talk to us. He said everything had gone well, but Callum would need to stay in the hospital for a while, that his body was still fragile, recovering. In the first days, it was something. You could only enter the room all protected with a mask, gloves, you know. Callum was weak, but you could already see in his eyes that he was reacting, improving. Griffin, thank God, recovered quickly. In a week, he was already walking around, wanting to see his brother all the time. But Callum, poor thing, went more slowly. He spent almost 2 months in the hospital, and we took turns. 1 hour, it was me. Another hour, my father, my mother, and even Griffin, so as not to leave Callum alone. When Callum finally was discharged after a long 3 months in total, counting the time before and after the surgery, my Callum could breathe the air outside that hospital. But the doctor immediately warned that the recovery would be long. In the first months, he had to return to the hospital every week for exams and to see how he was doing. Ah, my dear, this part of the story was quite complicated. Let me tell you exactly how it happened. Those who think everything was fine in our lives after the hospital are mistaken. We faced many challenges, you know. After Callum returned home, close friends began to visit him. It was beautiful to see the affection everyone had. Then Mr. Abernathy, during one of these visits, had an idea. He invited us to live in the front house while he would go to the back house. He said there was more space there, especially now with Piper. She would have her own room. We accepted and moved a few things, since both houses already had furniture. At first, everything was going well. We were taking care of Callum. Piper was happy. It seemed like things had worked out. But then, my dear, the trouble started. One day, the phone rang and I answered. It was one of Mr. Abernathy's sons, Gareth, asking for his father. That's when he found out from my mouth that we were living in the front house. I didn't even imagine the confusion this would cause. The following weekend, everyone arrived there. Sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, a crowd, and that's when all hell broke loose. They started saying all sorts of nonsense, saying we were taking advantage of Mr. Abernathy. Imagine that. We hadn't even asked for anything. It was he who offered. But since I was in need, I was foolish to accept. I didn't think of the consequences. These troublemakers kept saying we were trying to take Mr. Abernathy's house, that we only wanted his money. All lies. We just post at this point wanted to take care of Callum and have our family united. But what hurt me most, what really got to me, was when they called Callum a dying man. That was too much for me. I couldn't stand it and started arguing. Mr. Abernathy, poor thing, was crying, trying to explain that I was family, that he had proposed the exchange, but it wasn't forever. He told his children they didn't need to worry, but they wouldn't listen. It was as if he were invisible there. The poor man had no say in anything. They kicked us out, threatening to call the police if we didn't leave by Monday. Can you believe such a thing? You know, my dear, sometimes people don't understand what a real family is. We didn't want anything material. We just wanted to be close, to take care of each other. But there are people who only think about money, about inheritance, even when the person hasn't even died. And there we went, bag and baggage, to my mother's house. I never felt so humiliated in my life. They could have just talked to us. We would have left quietly. But they came for a war, you know. Callum was devastated, feeling guilty. Mr. Abernathy was between a rock and a hard place, divided between us and his children. And I was angry, hurt, feeling wronged. You know, my dear, sometimes people are blinded by jealousy, by greed. They couldn't see that we only wanted the best for Mr. Abernathy. They didn't understand that family goes beyond blood. And poor Mr. Abernathy, going through all this confusion, I was certain he would end up alone of everything. It was a difficult time for all of us. Callum was upset, thinking he had caused problems. We had to explain 1,000 times that it wasn't his fault. After all that confusion, we ended up going to my parents' house. We stayed in that little room that was mine when I was single. It was cramped, but we managed to pay. The important thing was to be together and take care of Callum. How good it was to have him at home. Imagine how tiring it was for us to take turns so much there in that hospital. And of course, there was my Piper, who had barely left the children's home and was already going through all that. The good part is that she got along well with my siblings. They were older than her, but they understood each other. We took care of Callum with all the love in the world. We made very hearty food, the way the doctor had recommended, Those really thick soups full of vegetables. Well, that's what we had most at home, and we helped him do some light exercises to regain his strength. Griffin started working at the grocery store, carrying boxes of fruit. It was heavy work, but he didn't complain. And look at this good thing. Every time he visited us, he brought some bags full of fruits, vegetables, and greens. You know how it is with grocery stores, right? They always have those things they think they can't sell anymore and we're going to throw away. Griffin, smart as he is, took all that and brought it to us. They were good things, just because they had a little spot here, a slightly wilted leaf there, they were going to waste it. His visits were always welcome, not only for the company, but because of all those fruits and vegetables. It helped a lot with our expenses, and Callum was all happy to see his brother, even if it was for a short time. The bad part is that he had to make a small trip because we lived far away. And look at this funny thing that happened. My friend Bryn started visiting us more often. At first, I thought it was just to give support, but later I realized she was interested in Griffin. And wouldn't you know, he was interested in her too. It was beautiful to see that romance being born there in the midst of so much difficulty. Time passed, and Callum improved a lot. Each day he got stronger, more animated. It was a blessing to see him recovering like that, walking and eating by himself. Then one day, we received a surprise visit. It was an old professor of Callum's. He was happy to see how Callum was recovering well and made a proposal. He said he would give a good job to Callum in the company where he worked as soon as Callum was ready. You should have seen Callum's face when he heard this. His eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen for a long time. It was as if he had gained a new hope, It was a difficult time, but also full of good things. We were together, Callum was improving, Griffin had found Bryn, and now there was this promise of a job. It was as if God was showing us that after the storm comes the calm. About 20 days after that visit from the professor, Callum got all dressed up. My, how that man looked handsome when he spruced up. He went to meet the professor and returned with wonderful news. He had gotten a job with an even better salary than he received before the illness. It was pure joy. Callum and I agreed that I wouldn't work outside the home. I would stay home taking care of Piper. I enrolled her in the school where I had studied. When she turned 7, I myself took her every day. The path passed near Mr. Abernathy's house, so we always made a little stop there to see him. Girl, you should have seen Mr. Abernathy's happiness when we arrived. He would open that big smile, hug and kiss little Piper. She had been calling him Grandpa for some time. And you know something? Piper had also been calling Callum and me Dad and Mom for quite some time. Every time she said Dad or Mom, my heart melted. Mr. Abernathy rented the back house to new tenants. And you can already imagine, right? They soon became friends. It was good, because that way he wasn't so alone. Now his children, discontinued in that way. They didn't change much after all that commotion. But Mr. Abernathy didn't let that interfere with his happiness. He said we were the family he chose to have around. I'll move forward in time now because incredible things happened to me. I'm sure you didn't expect this one. Time went by, and at a certain point, Griffin, Callum's brother, was already married to Bryn. It was so beautiful to see those two together, and they didn't waste time, They had 4 children, 2 pairs. It was so beautiful to see all those children. They ended up going to live in the back of Bryn's mother's house. Poor thing, she was a widow, so it was good to have her daughter and son-in-law nearby. They built a little house back there, They used the money from the sale of Griffin's childhood home for this. That old house wasn't worth much, but the little it gave helped a lot. Callum didn't even want to know about his part of that money. Thank God we weren't in need. He insisted that Griffin keep everything. Griffin made good use of that money, He built a good little house for his children to have space to grow. It was small but cozy. It was a pleasure to see how happy they were there. My dear, seeing Griffin with that beautiful family of his gave me such joy in my heart. After everything he and Callum went through, separated for so long, it was as if God was compensating, giving double all the blessings. We were always visiting each other. It was a party when everyone got together. Well, now what I'm going to tell you will surprise you. And time kept passing again. When I realized I was already 43 years old, my little Piper, that little girl we adopted, was already a young woman of 24, married for 2.5 years, and expecting her second child. It was all joy. Then out of nowhere, I started feeling ill. It was a terrible malaise. I felt waves of heat that came from nowhere. I would sweat cold. Sometimes I would get irritated for no reason, There were days I would wake up with a terrible headache. My sleep got all messed up. There were nights I couldn't close my eyes, and my breasts, got swollen and painful. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, or maybe the beginning of menopause. After all, at 43, it was to be expected, right? My mother told me that's how it had happened with her, so I had already accepted it. But the symptoms didn't pass. There were days when I even felt nauseous. I decided to go to the doctor, more to clear my conscience. I thought he would say it was indeed menopause, and that would be it. But when I got there, the doctor did some tests and surprise, I was pregnant, about 8 weeks, or 2 months. I was in shock. What? Me, pregnant after so much time? For years, I had resigned myself to never having children. We had even stopped trying, I thought it wasn't meant to be. I left the doctor's office not knowing whether to laugh or cry. It was a mixture of joy, fear, surprise all together. My dear, sometimes life surprises us when we least expect it. There I was, thinking it was the end of a phase with menopause coming, and it was actually the beginning of another beautiful thing. It was crazy, but a good kind of crazy. I was a grandmother of 2 and a first-time mother at the same time. Who would have thought, right? But that's how it happened, thank God. At this time, Callum and I already had a beautiful house with a large yard, a beautiful orchard that I tended with great care. He had bought it for us years ago. I never went back to work outside the home. I was truly a housewife. My greatest pleasure was taking care of my family. And then, out of nowhere, God presents me with this miracle. Being pregnant was a novelty for me. The women in the family were very excited. They considered our lives a true miracle, because of Callum having discovered his brother and being saved from that disease that had already condemned him. It was beautiful to see my big belly growing. How good it was, my God. I would spend hours caressing my belly, talking to the baby. Callum, well, he was always with his hand on my belly, waiting to feel the baby move. When the time came, a beautiful baby girl was born, blonde like her father. We named her Laurel. There couldn't have been a more appropriate name, right? She was a true victory for us after everything we went through. Laurel was a light in our house, along with the rest of the family. Everything was complete now. Seeing Piper, already a mother of 2, helping to take care of her little sister was a beautiful thing. Bentley, my grandson, had been born about 3 months before Laurel. Being pregnant at the same time was a very memorable experience for me and for her. Callum seemed to have rejuvenated by 20 years. He was always playing, telling stories, rocking Laurel. Looking back now, I realize how our lives were transformed through all these trials. From the pain of Callum's illness came the blessing of finding his brother. From our inability to have children came the joy of adopting Piper, and later, the miracle of Laurel. God's timing was perfect, even when we couldn't see it. And through it all, we learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the bonds we create through love, sacrifice, and faith. And Mr. Abernathy, he was very sick. It was a story that, despite all the happiness I was feeling with Laurel's arrival, deep down, Callum, Piper, and I were suffering a lot. Unfortunately, he was found by a tenant in his house, unconscious on the floor. Thank God they managed to help in time, but he had had a stroke. Mr. Abernathy's stroke was ischemic, which is when a clot blocks the blood flow to a part of the brain. This caused him to be paralyzed on the left side of his body. The doctors explained that brain cells, without receiving oxygen and nutrients, began to die rapidly. When we went to visit him in the hospital, it was heartbreaking. Mr. Abernathy, who had always been so active and full of life, was there in bed, barely able to speak. The left side of his face was drooping, and he couldn't move his left arm and leg. The doctors said the recovery would be long and difficult. He would need physiotherapy, speech therapy, and a lot of support from the family. His speech was slurred, difficult to understand, and he had difficulty even swallowing. Seeing Mr. Abernathy in that state was a shock for all of us. It was a time of much prayer, of much faith. We asked God for strength to face this trial and for Mr. Abernathy to recover. It was difficult, but we didn't lose hope. Well, one of Mr. Abernathy's sons, Garrett, yes, the same one who had caused that awful scene at the house years before, came to find us at the hospital. He arrived looking humble, begging for forgiveness, imploring pardon. You could see he was truly sorry. He said he had seen how we were worried about his father in the hospital, how we cared and truly cared. This moved him, you know. It made him see things in a different way. But then came the difficult part. He said he would have to take Mr. Abernathy to his house in another city. He said his father couldn't live alone anymore after the stroke, that he needed constant care. Deep down, I thought it was the right thing to do. After all, he was his son, and at least he wasn't abandoning Mr. Abernathy in a nursing home, right? This showed that despite everything, he cared about his father. We forgave him, yes. There was no point in holding a grudge, especially at a time like this. The important thing was Mr. Abernathy's well-being. It was too difficult to say goodbye. We knew we would probably never see Mr. Abernathy again. Callum was devastated. Piper cried a lot. I tried to be strong, but inside, my heart was broken. When they left, taking Mr. Abernathy, it was as if they took a piece of us with them. We stood there, watching the car move away with a lump in our throats and eyes full of tears. You know, my dear, sometimes life forces us to make difficult decisions. We wanted to be able to take care of Mr. Abernathy, but we understood that perhaps it was better for him to be with his family at this moment, especially because now we had the babies who demanded a lot of our time. We never saw Mr. Abernathy again after that, but he remained forever in our hearts. We always remember him with affection, the stories he told, the way he laughed, how he loved Piper. The years have gone by, and sometimes I still sit alone in my garden, thinking about the journey we've lived through. I've come to understand that forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a process that unfolds day by day. When I told Callum I didn't want a child from the orphanage, I unknowingly wounded the man I loved so deeply. But that pain taught me a kind of empathy I didn't know I was missing. Forgiving Mr. Abernathy's children was much harder. Every time I remember how they turned us away, the anger still bubbles up inside me. But over time, I realized they were acting out of fear and misunderstanding. Forgiving them didn't mean accepting how they treated us. It meant freeing myself from the weight of resentment. The hardest part was learning to forgive myself, for doubting, for judging, for not seeing God's greater plan. But every morning when I wake up and see my family, Callum, Piper, Laurel, and our grandchildren, I know that this life, with all its twists and turns, is exactly where I'm meant to be. Ah, there you are. I've been hoping you'd stop by. Come sit with me for a while. I want to share something that still stirs my soul, no matter how much time has passed. If my story has touched you, consider subscribing to this channel for more stories about love, forgiveness, and faith. Sometimes we just need a reminder that even our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength.